Hello and welcome to episode 23 of series 4 of the Engaging Internal Comms podcast. This is the show for employee engagers and internal communicators who like to keep up to date with all that is new in our profession. My name's Craig Smith from The Big Picture People. So I'm just going to quickly cover off what we've got coming up in some future episodes. In our next episode, which goes out on the 7th of November, which is episode 24 of this series, we have an interview with Jen Sproul and Susanna Holton. Jen is from the IOIC. In fact, she's the CEO of the IOIC, and Susanna is from Ipsos, Carrion and Box. And the IOIC recently commissioned Ipsos, Carrion and Box to carry out a survey for them in terms of what employees currently feel about internal communications. So we've got an interview with Jen and with Susanna, who are going to be telling us all about the findings of that survey, which is a really interesting piece of work. And I think if you're involved in internal comms, or in fact any part of employee engagement, OD, you'll find this a really interesting interview. So that's going out on the 7th of November. And then on the 21st of November, which is episode 25, I've got an interview with Maurice Decoing. Maurice is from Decoing Human Capital, and Maurice is going to be telling us all about the return on investment of psychological safety, why we should be investing in our psychological safety programs, what psychological safety is, and why it's important within organizations, and particularly in the climate that we're in at the moment with an increased emphasis on mental health and personal and psychological well-being. I think it will be a really interesting and useful episode for you. Anyway, so that's what we've got coming up in future episodes. I'm not going to say anything else. Let's get into this episode's interview. I'm going to keep this introduction quite short because the interview that follows is quite a long one, but it's very, very in-depth and one that I thoroughly enjoyed. The interview itself is going to be all about how we have a misalignment within our organizations between our strategy and our culture. And also our customer experience or our end user experience, and how this disconnect plays out in our organizations and can cause us big challenges and big issues. So I'm not going to really tell you any more about the interview. I'll let you listen to it for yourself. But I think what I wanted to point out, and we don't talk about our work very often, but as you're listening to this, if you perceive you have this sort of disconnect within your organization where there's a misalignment between your strategy, how well it's understood, how well it's been embodied within your organization, and also the cultural disconnect between it, then I think it would be really good if we could talk with you, if you want to get in touch with us, because this is exactly the sort of work that we do at the Big Picture People, which is to help organizations to, first of all, help their employees and everybody in their organization understand their strategy, but also to then communicate it in a way that people can see how culturally we need to change our behaviors, we need to change our mindsets, we need to change the way we behave with each other and with our external world in order to be able to be successful. So I just wanted to point that out as you listen to this interview. If this is something that you're wanting to address within your organization, then definitely be worth getting in touch with us at The Big Picture People, and you can do that by emailing us at info@thebigpicturepeople.co.uk. Anyway, I'll shut up and let you enjoy the interview. My guest on this episode is Richard Nugent. Richard is the founder and MD of 21 Leadership. Over the past 15 years, Richard has worked with some of the biggest and best-known organizations in the world. He helps fast-paced organizations to build their capability and capacity for change. His typical clients are executive teams at FTSE 250 type businesses, and who are looking to grow and change their strategic direction. Richard is the author of the recent published book, The Alignment Advantage. So, hello, Richard. This is your second interview on the show. So, how are you? And just for the listeners, where are you based, please, Richard?
I'm brilliant. It's fantastic to be back with you, Craig. And I am up in the northeast of England. We have a base about 9 miles east from Newcastle. So I know it's a territory you're familiar with. And it's nice, as we're recording this, it's school holidays. So I haven't been out on the road. I've been spending plenty of time with the family. And at the same time, I'm already kind of getting ready for the last third of the year. I'm raring to go again. So all good.
Brilliant. Excellent. Yeah, you're just down the road from me, but we're recording this virtually. But yeah, we're not a million miles from each other. So anyway, Richard, just for the people who maybe haven't heard you on the previous interview, just tell us a little bit more about what you do. I've kind of given a brief introduction there, and also maybe tell us more about the book, The Alignment Advantage.
Yeah, so 21 Leadership, formed we formed the consultancy with a clear kind of understanding and belief that leadership is the competitive advantage in business today.
Mm.
We made a decision right at the beginning that we were going to be a leadership consultancy because that was the difference that I think I could make to clients and the kinds of organizations that I want to work with. And that core belief backs that up. I believe that if you take two organizations that are similar in a similar sector, competing for a similar marketplace, either one of them can, invest in their IT infrastructure or increase their wage bill to bring more people in or different people into the organization. But for me, it would be the organization that has a greater leadership capability at all levels, the greater ability to coach and motivate and inspire and engage and to lead change. It'll be that one that will be more successful in the long run. So everything we do as an organization is really geared up for that. And we are a small organization. I was speaking to one of the big consultancies who've asked us to partner with them on a big piece of work abroad a few weeks ago. And I said, there was a book in my early days I read, which was something like How to Be Great Rather Than Big as an organization. That really took hold. That's something that's always lasted with me. So we're not a huge organization, but we're really fortunate. We punch above our weight in terms of the clients we work with, people like Milne Entertainment, Samsung, Warner Brothers, Majid Al Fateh. Over the years, we've worked with some absolutely fantastic organizations. Recently did a piece of work with Netflix and CBRE. So the kind of clients we work with tend to be fast-paced. They tend to be growing. They tend to be, always moving and always needing that leadership capability to take them to where they need to get to, high demand, high results. And they often want it to be a great place to work as well. And those two things, to balance those two things is a real challenge, which is part of what drove me towards our work around Aligned and the Alignment Advantage.
Yeah, excellent. No, I know we've worked together before, and huge respecter of your work, and yeah, absolutely, all of the things you've said there, totally back that up. So yeah, let's move on to the book then, Richard, because I think this is kind of culmination, perhaps, of that philosophy and a lot of years of observation and also some research as well. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about the book and some of the initial findings, and then we'll delve into some more detail on those.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. It is a piece of work that emerged over a period of years. We're constantly developing ourselves and growing and researching, and we're fortunate to partner with people like the London School of Economics who do research projects for us. And I'd always, certainly for about a 10-year period, I'd really been a culture guy. Culture fascinates me. I think it's such an enabler. It's where I really enjoy, proper culture change programs. And as with you, I know where people are looking to develop a new cultural narrative and embed a set of values, or get people engaged and aligned with a vision. That was always where I'd hung out. But there was this nagging piece that was missing for me, and it took quite a long time to be able to articulate it and almost codify it. And what I realized was that there was a misalignment between an organization's strategy and commercial intent and the cultural work that was going on. And there always seemed to be this either a lack of connection between the two, or even worse, the two were almost set against each other. You'd either have an organization that was really commercial and really strategic, and the cultural stuff was seen as a bit soft and fluffy that are kind of nice to have later on. Or, certainly in the past kind of 10 to 15 years with the emergence of all of this Start With Why stuff, that it was all about let's have a purpose-driven organization, and therefore the kind of commercial resultsy stuff almost became slightly dirty word. And there was a deep discomfort with that. And what's emerged in the last 5 or 6 years is an understanding that if an organization wants to have a real advantage in their marketplace against their competitors, then aligning understanding between their strategy, the culture that they want to bring to life, and the experience they want to create for their customers, visitors, guests, clients, that creates an advantage. And in fact, our own research, we've asked hundreds and hundreds of organizations now 6 very simple questions that shines a light on the degree to which their teams, and in particular the senior teams, are aligned in their thinking across strategy, culture, and what we call the X, which is customer experience plus brand. What we found is it's actually less than 3% of organizations, when they talk about strategy, culture, and experience, are even talking about the same thing as the other people in the organization. So by aligning understanding across those 3 areas and actually aligning strategy and culture and experience, organizations can have an advantage over 97% of their competitors.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, that's quite a stark figure. I mean, guess just before we go into this, because this is something we're going to be exploring. I know we were going to talk about this later on. I'm actually going to bring it forward because I know I heard you talking on another interview, and I know this is sort of, we've talked about this before. Is this? And I really like this way that you define this about being really clear about what some really important words mean. And I think strategy and culture and to a certain extent customer service are some of those terms that I think people have. You'll go, well, let's talk about strategy, and we're all talking about something slightly different because we haven't got a common definition of it. So I know I was going to cover this later on with you. What are we talking about when we're talking about strategy, culture, and customer experience? Just so we can kind of put some edges to those concepts, because again, people listening to this might have a very different perspective of what those 3 things are to a greater or lesser extent. So what's your working definition of those three key elements of your book and your work, Richard?
And look, I will share them, but I'd like to make this really clear. If I had to go into work with a senior team and they give me a definition of strategy and it's different to mine, but they all agree with each other,
yeah, okay,
then I'm happy for them to go with theirs.
Right.
And similar with culture, similar with things like brand. So that point's just, it sounds like a small point. If anybody's listening to this, it might sound small, but actually, my starting point for this work is not to say this is how you should define strategy.
Right.
I have got a decision and I believe in it, a definition, I believe in it. But actually, if somebody's got their own definition, they all agree with each other, that's even more important. However, as you know, as we've talked about, that it's quite rarely the case. It's much more often that when, 3 of those 6 key questions I mentioned earlier are: what is your definition of strategy? What is your definition of culture? And what for you is the distinction between customer service and customer experience? And when I ask senior teams those questions, invariably there are different answers. So my definition of strategy is that strategy is the overall key strategic objective. The overall big smart goal that organization or that team has to deliver. So it's the overall key strategic objective, plus the rich, multifaceted sub strategies that go all the way down into the tactics and actions, that when they are activated, everything that's activated chunks back up to deliver the overall key strategic objective.
So I guess in Jim Collins' language, we're talking about the big, hairy, audacious goal, and then all of the things that then help us to get to that big, hairy, audacious goal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I know the way I describe it, it's not, it doesn't trip off the tongue. It's not particularly sexy, but when I was doing, I really got forced into strategy. I, like lots of other people, it turns out, I thought I was the only person in the room who didn't understand what strategy was. Everyone talked about strategy, and I didn't know what it was. And in the end, I avoided it. In the end, I got forced into a corner by a client, and I had to go in and do a kind of a study piece. And I read all sorts of books, and I went on various programs. I remember going on a strategic leadership for entrepreneurs program, a 6-month program at one of the top London business schools. And I came out of that, and I could do a wicked SWOT analysis, but I still didn't really understand what strategy was, And eventually, everything came together into creating an understanding and a framework that we could work with. But one of the key inputs in that for me was a book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rummelt. And in there, he says that a strategy is only a strategy when all elements are present. So when you look at some organizations' websites, they might say our strategy is to make 4 billion EBITDA by such and such a date.
Mm.
That with a bit of shaping, that becomes a good key strategic objective, the overall strategic objective. But a strategic objective in itself is not a strategy. It's part of a strategy, but it's not a strategy. And in other organizations, they'll, our strategy is to become, the number one market leader in our industry. Again, that's a bit more of a vision, which for me fits into the cultural narrative. It's definitely not a strategy. The other thing that I see a lot in organizations, especially ones that have grown really quickly, is they might have a big, as you say, big, hairy, audacious goal, or they might have a big key strategic objective. But then underneath it, there isn't a strategy. There's effectively just thousands and thousands and
Yeah.
thousands of actions. And which again, a big action plan is not a strategy. For it to be a strategy, you've got to have the big, strategic objective, which is smart. It's not a vision. It's not something which is unachievable. It's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time bound. And then essentially the process is you take that overall key strategic objective, you break it down into a number of sub objectives. So we call them enabling objectives. Those enabling objectives are broken down into further objectives, and so on, until eventually you do end up with actions and tactics. But all of those actions and tactics are in service of a set of objectives, which when they're all delivered, deliver the objectives above them, and so on and so on. So it's the overall, a strategy is only a strategy when it's all of those elements together. And what I find useful when we're helping organizations to define strategy and then define their own strategy, we say, look, for a period of time, even if it's only 3 months, let's not use the word strategy for anything other than that big whole thing.
Yeah.
Because one of the challenges with strategy is we use the word to mean so many different things,
Yeah.
So, a lot of what we do actually in defining strategy is helping people to understand what isn't strategy, first of all.
Yeah, I agree.
So that's the first one. Culture, a little bit more simple. My favorite definition of culture is that culture is how we be around here. And I know it's not very good English, but if and you'll have done this, 1,000 times, I know, Craig, if you go into a group and ask people what is culture, they'll typically say things like, it's how we behave, how it feels to work around here, what's important. And I think culture is actually all of those things and more. Culture is how we show up for each other, in the moment regularly. It's what we demonstrate is important by our actions. It's what we allow, it's what we make okay by not managing or by managing. It's how it feels. But it's also how we go about doing the work. And I know this is something that your work is brilliant at enabling and guiding. The culture and how we do the work are not separate. How we do the work is reflective of the culture. It's as much of an indicator of the culture as as anything that might happen when people pass each other in a corridor. So my favorite definition of culture is that it's how we be around here. And then for me, when we define the difference between customer service and customer experience, service is what we, as the organization, is what we give, whereas experience is what the guests, customers, clients, visitors have. And it sounds like a simple distinction, but I'm a real believer that service and experience aren't two different parts of the same continuum. Customer service and customer experience are fundamentally different things. You can control everything you do from a service point of view, and that won't necessarily have a positive impact on the customer experience. In fact, we've got a ton of examples that show doing too much on customer service can make the customer experience worse. Now, that's not saying that it's bad to be a customer service organization. If somebody just wants to deliver, the same stuff consistently. I often use the example of going to a petrol station or a gas station if you're in the States. And I'm not sure I totally believe this, because I think I want to have a bit of an experience in as much as I want the pumps to be clean. I don't want to be, smelling of diesel or whatever afterwards. But essentially, if I go to a petrol station and I can get my fuel in my car and I can go and pay quickly, and it's all very transactional, like you can go to an automated petrol station or gas station, stick your card in. You don't have to have any interaction. That's cool with me. But there's lots of other organizations that want to give really great experience. They want their customers, guests, visitors, clients to go away with a feeling about the experience they've had. And if your organization wants that, then you have to focus on creating those experiences and measuring them. You can't be a great experience organization just by doing service, which is
Yeah.
why that distinction between service being what you give, experience being what they have. So
Yeah. No,
they're
I
my
think
three starting definitions.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important, and I like that distinction actually, and when it's one I'd not really thought of, and I guess that applies, you using the word customer in anyone who is a recipient of your service or product, whether you refer to them as customers, because I like you, I probably work with a lot of organisations who, well, we don't call them customers here, but they're more kind of end users or recipients, but yeah.
And that's why we talk about the X in our aligned framework. The S
Mm-hmm.
is strategy, C is culture, and the X is everything which is the external experience.
Yeah.
So there's that is that end user experience of whatever type it is, plus brand in its purest essence. And again, just for that sake of defining things in green on the meaning of important words, a lot of the time when people talk about brand, they're actually either talking about branding,
Yes.
logos, typefaces, iconography, or increasingly, I see, people are showing up on The Apprentice, for example, in the UK, and talking about, I've established a brand which is X, Y, Z, and they don't mean brand; they actually just mean company.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but brand, I think my favorite definition at the minute, and this is coined by my business partner and friend Ross Aiken, he talks about brand is what you do multiplied by your reputation.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And lots of
Yeah.
people talk about brand as being what people will say about you, when your back's turned. So it is. That's why customer experience and brand aren't quite the same thing, because you can have a brand experience when you aren't interacting, when you're not a customer of the
Yes.
organization.
Yeah.
But the actual what you're looking to create, from the inside out of an organization for both brand and customer experience, they're very similar things. It's that feeling, that reputation that you're looking to create in others, that whether we like it or not, this often doesn't go down very well, especially with marketing people. Actually, that means if they're the definitions, it means we can't wholly own either our brand or our customer experience. All we can do is everything that we can internally to have as big an influence on that in the right direction as we
Yeah.
possibly can.
Yeah. Hence why that sort of trinity of things that you talk about in the book and that you've talked about today is that alignment is so key, because I guess for someone who's kind of looking at this from a kind of from an external perspective, the outlier on those three things might be the customer experience bit. The strategy and the culture you kind of get, but the kind of customer experience thing is the thing that I think you need to explain in the way you have to make sure you understand why that is part of that three-way, that sort of triangle that I'm visualizing in my mind, and I think you include it's on there's a logo on the book that I'm looking at now. I'm not sure whether that's subliminal or not, but so Richard, let's get that. I think I know it's kind of jumped ahead a little bit, but let's just dial back then to, so you talked about that 97% of organizations don't have that. There's a very small number where there is an alignment between those three things, which I thinking about the companies that we work with and some of the clients we work with, that sounds, it doesn't sound as a bigger gulf as to people who may think that is a big number. That kind of, I can get that. What's the downside of that? And it may seem like obvious that not having those three things or any of those elements aligned is a problem. What does that misalignment do, and how is it debilitating to an organization when they don't have that alignment?
Yeah, it's a good question, Craig. Well, let's start with the first two elements. So, as I say, strategy and culture are often talked about, at odds with each other. And the challenge with that is culture has to be created to be a strategic enabler. If your culture isn't a strategic enabler, it's a strategic blocker. And we're working with a large UK organisation, which is very well known in its field at the moment. And however, the business performance and one or two things in the marketplace is meaning they're having to do a lot of cost cutting. They've done various reorganizations. They've tried to get their next, reinvestment, refinancing, and that fell through. And I think their biggest challenge isn't their strategy; it's their culture. There is in my view, a dangerously negative culture in the organization. And there is a big gulf between those who work in the operational area of the organization and those who work in the kind of central functions. And that's, that is an example of why misalignment's detrimental. Now, that's a bit of an extreme example, but actually in most organizations, the challenge is just that we don't think about strategy and culture as a partnership like that. If you're an organization that's going to, grow from 2 billion to 6 billion over the next 7 years, as one of our other clients are trying to do, then that strategic intent has clear implications on the culture required in order to get there. Whereas, as you have, we've spent some time in the housing association sector, social housing. Now, it's a really challenging sector that's gone through a huge amount of change in the last 20 years. But most of the organizations in that sector aren't on a huge growth track. And therefore, if this is really about, in that case, the strategy is really about servicing their end users as well as they possibly can and not growth, then that probably has a different set of implications on their culture. So just that coupling is really important. And if you don't have that, there's a danger that you end up with a culture that gets in the way of delivering your strategic intent. And then if we go to the kind of second coupling in the triad, I'm a real believer that your customer experience or your end user experience cannot outperform your employee experience for any prolonged period of time.
Okay.
So your customer experience can't outperform your employee experience for any prolonged period of time. Therefore, not only does your culture have to be shaped to deliver your strategic intent, but it also has to be shaped in such a way that it reflects the external experience that you want to create. And therefore, if you don't think about those two things together, you can be making brand and customer promises that your culture just cannot deliver upon. And I experience this as a customer regularly. There's a huge airline that we'd all be familiar with in this country, in the UK, that just makes these big, bold, brand positioning statements. But as an end user, it just doesn't feel like that at all. And having a little bit of an insight into some of the cultural challenges internally, I can totally understand why. So, which is why, again, that clarity is so important. We work with lots and lots of, very customer, very visitor, very guest-facing organizations. And one of the questions they ask is, what is the experience that you would want me to have? If I came to stay in your hotel, stay in your resort, stay in your, be a direct customer of your business, what is the experience that you'd want me to have? And in what way, what's the little distinction that I would have in experience which separates you from your competitors? Quite often the definition around the table, even with really senior people, even with those people who are in charge of customer service or customer experience, they can't clearly define it. So not only does that have implications on how do you know you're measuring the right thing, but also it has implications on we don't really quite know what the culture we're trying to create internally is. We don't know really what kind of people we're quite trying to hire, because until we've got that definition clear and aligned between us, then we don't know fully what the culture is we're trying to shape. So you end up, the best metaphor that I can give to answer the question maybe a bit more succinctly is, you can find this on YouTube, even though it's probably 50 years old or something now. There's a really old Monty Python sketch. And it's called The 100 Yards for the directionally challenged.
Yeah.
100 yards tells you how old it is. And if you imagine there's a bunch of people lining up on a starting line as if they're going to run a 100 meters race,
Yeah.
and the gun goes off and everybody just runs off in different directions.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think so many organizations are operating in that way. Everyone's shooting off in different directions because there isn't a clear lined understanding and a clear connection between strategy, culture, and the X.
I remember that sketch well. Yeah, I might even put a link to it into the show notes. I've never put a link to anything to do with Monty Python into my podcast show notes, but you've given me the golden. Yeah, and I know I really like that. And I'm gonna ask you. While you were talking earlier, I sketched a question down that wasn't on our kind of plan of questions I was going to ask you. So this is a bit naughty, Richard, but I think it's a nice question for us to explore together, and it's probably one knowing you'd have thought of before. So you and I both know that. Very, very, very rarely are we in that position to start with a kind of blank sheet of paper, either from a strategic perspective or from a cultural perspective. So when you go into, and I'm not ignoring customer experience for, I'm just trying to simplify it to make it more binary question. I guess we could apply it to that third element as well. And we but just for simplicity. So if you go into a situation where there is clearly that misalignment, what are you going to change? Are you going to try and change the strategy to meet the culture? Or are you going to try and change the culture to meet the strategy? Because both of us know that neither of those are easy, because you're often working within a paradigm that the strategy might be something that we've kind of, it's kind of given to us to a certain extent by the mothership organization, or it's kind of, it's almost kind of cast in stone and never to be challenged. But also the culture, as we know, is notoriously difficult, but especially we've got lots of people and that culture has been around for a long time and it's very ingrained. Where would you start in that sort of scenario? What would you try and shift, or would you try and bring them both together to converge at some point in the kind of non-defined point of where they could potentially overlap?
Yeah, it's good question. It goes back to the power of these kind of critical 6 questions. So because we start off pretty much every piece of work by asking them, and we've actually got a more in-depth diagnostic that we use actually on occasion these days, because the critical 6 tend to nail it the vast majority of times. But what that does is, if the first two questions are, what is strategy, and what is the key strategic objective that you're working to deliver? If we were in an organization or in a team where everybody around the table gives the same answers as each other to those two questions, then that's taken care of. It's actually very rare that happens. So if the next questions then is, what is your definition of culture? And this is like having a favorite question out of the 6 is a little bit like, have you got a favorite child? But at the moment, the answers that I'm getting to this question are just incredibly fascinating. So the next question is, on a scale of 1 to 6, to what degree does your current culture support the delivery of your strategic objective? Right. So what we're asking in those first 4 questions and those 2 couplings is, how clear are you on what strategy is, and what your strategy is? And then the second is, how clear are you in what culture is, and how right is your culture? Now, what's the reason I think that question 4 is really interesting is there are fairly regular occasions. It's probably the majority, not quite, but probably the majority, where on a scale of 1 to 6, to what degree does your current culture support the delivery of your strategic objectives? And people will give it a 4, 5, or 6. So they're going, cool, it's taken care of. What we then do is go back and check their answers to number 2, which is, what is your strategic objectives? If they weren't all crystal clear and aligned on their answer to question number 2, they actually can't answer question number 4.
Yeah.
Because and this has happened on a couple of occasions in particular, where everyone will say, no, we're a 5 or a 6, our culture is awesome. But if they don't know what they're shooting for strategically, they don't know whether their culture is right. It might be a nice place to work, but that doesn't mean it's that culture is right. So what I'm saying is, strategy has to be clear and aligned first. But by asking the questions, that guides us as to where we need to pay most attention
Mm, mm,
in terms of that focus on strategy or culture. There
mm,
has been, I think, probably one occasion where the strategy was pretty much nailed. And then when we delved into the culture, that was what was the kind of issue. So
mm,
we started by saying, look, you've got the strategy's not your key issue. We worked on the culture. They came together much more as an overall. It was the kind of top couple of teams we were working with. But what was interesting is, as the culture strengthened in the right direction, as a team, as a community, they then went back and said, hang on a minute, we're clear on what the strategy is, but we're now in a position to look at it in a slightly different light and say, is it right?
yeah.
And it was the key strategic goal had been handed down from them, from organizational on high.
Mm,
So they said, actually, now we're in this position of strength because we're operating as a high performing team to go back and challenge that a little bit. So
mm,
so
mm.
yeah, that diagnostic tells us where to start. However, the strategy's got to be the starting point, because out of that comes what is the culture that we need to shape.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, it's just fascinating when the more I listen to it and think about it, the more I kind of think I'm thinking of some of the people, organizations I work with, and I'm thinking particularly in sectors that are, and I don't want to kind of get too specific because some of my clients might be listening to this, but particularly in sectors where there's a heavy cultural legacy that links to either the profession itself, say for
Mm-hmm.
that they work in. There's kind of, it's not that organization's culture, but it's a culture of, if you are a such and such, you kind
Yes.
of think and behave like this.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore how difficult that is for leadership teams who do have a very have a good strategy to be able to mold that culture when it's got so many kind of endemic challenges associated with it that they just haven't got they haven't got the ability to just start again, as it were. And it is, but it's really interesting way of thinking about it. And so what I'm taking from that is, you start with the strategy, and then it's then to look at how we can shape the culture in order to deliver the strategy. Because if you're trying to, two moving points and you're trying to change both of them, that's going to be, or you don't pin one of them down first, you kind of, you've got no point of reference, have you?
Totally, and I absolutely hear what you're saying, and you're right. There are some industries, some organisations where it is just much more difficult to
Mm,
change the culture. It's a longer process. I was doing a little bit of coaching with somebody who is uh, essentially a kind of business head of a particular organization in Germany, and the
mm,
works councils in Germany have got such a strength and such an
mm,
influence. Their culture change timeline looks quite different to what it would be for most of the clients we work with in UK, US, where if you want to drive a change through, you can just essentially drive a
yeah,
change through as long as
yeah,
you've got the capability. So I get that. However, there's two things that really help in this.
mm,
Um, uh, and when people have a conversation like you and I are fortunate because we sit outside of
yeah,
organizations, and I think people by nature then will often kind of listen to us slightly differently. But lots of times in organizations, people open up a conversation about culture, and there is still, even in this day and age, this slight, oh yeah, but it's the nice to have. Oh, that's all very well. We're talking about, people often think of culture being about making this a nice place to work, or a great place to work, or a Times Top 100, or best companies. And it's a bit of a fluffy add-on.
mm,
And what we're saying here is, no, absolutely not. If you don't get this right, it gets in the way of you delivering your strategic intent. Really, and this is the second point. Part of the thing that influenced this is when we developed our own culture change framework. I'm going to say it's about 7 or 8 years ago. I can't remember exactly. But one of the things that we found through this big modeling project we did of organizations who'd started culture change and nailed them
mm,
versus companies who'd started culture change programs and hadn't, was that at the beginning, those that had nailed them had pretty much all set out a business case for change,
mm,
a business change for the culture change, in the same ways they'd set out a business case for changing an IT system,
mm,
or changing any other kind of standard operating procedure. And what we found was if organizations didn't do that, they just set it out and said, hey, we need this, we want to change the culture, or too many people are leaving, so we need to change it. Very quickly, some other strategic imperative would come along and trump it. Whereas if you set out a proper business case for change, a proper burning platform, or a proper opportunity point that makes the culture change critical to the success of the organization, not in people terms, not in HR terms, but in financial terms or operational terms, that was one of the things that changed the dial in culture change. And it was one of the influences in this framework where it made me realize, well, the only way to create that business change properly is to be really crystal clear on what the strategic intent is. So having that link really does, it helps that early conversation, because you're not just changing it to make it better or more modern, but actually you're changing it to help us to deliver what we need to deliver. And frankly, if an organization has people in there that aren't interested in helping it to deliver what it needs to deliver, we need to find ways to move it out.
Absolutely.
This one of the interviews in the book is somebody I've known for a lot of years in a different context, but he's a head teacher, and he applied the whole aligned framework to what was a school in a really challenging part of Northumberland, and for lots of reasons, there's lots of reasons why it could have not worked, because, I'm speaking for me here, definitely not him, but I look at teaching as one of those professions, and education as a sector where it really is difficult to create lasting change to the system. Because frankly, you cannot just go in and fire a group of teachers if you don't think they're performing very well at a school, or you cannot change what Ofsted assesses a school on. You cannot change, what's measured in SATs. But even on that backdrop, he created a new school plan, which is the equivalent of a strategy. And he said, right, if this is what we're setting out to achieve, and you've all said you're up for this, because you care about what the students are achieving, and you care about the profile of the school and the community it serves, then let's look at what the culture needs to be like in order to do that. And it created a degree of buy-in that I don't think you would have been able to create if you just went in and said, hey, we want to change the values, we want to change the vision, we want to change how we be.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely. And you weren't a million miles away from the sector I was alluding to as well. So, anyway, so as I suspected, we kind of time is against us, because I always like talking to you, Richard, as you know, which is hence why I asked you to come on the show again. But there's one area I just want to cover off before we do have to wrap, and that is a really important part, because it's kind of something that's important to me and close to what we do as well, which is one thing you talked about. Again, I can't recall whether I read it in the book or whether it was in when I was kind of eavesdropping on another conversation you had on another podcast, was this idea of the difference between communication and understanding. And I know just before we started recording, I kind of shared with you a bit of research that I'm going to be covering in a future episode that's going out after yours, when I talked to Jen Sproul from the Institute of Internal Communications, based on some research they've done, which is that they've found this this sort of anomaly, they call it a slight paradox. I think it is a paradox, where in their research they've got a big discrepancy between the amount of people across the organization, whether that's from kind of frontline employees or up to senior management, in a discrepancy between people believing in the strategy but not actually fully understanding what it is. So ask the question, do you think we've got the right strategy? Yeah. Do you know what the strategy is? Well, I kind of know, but and they found a gap of like 14% at a senior management level. This difference between communication and understanding, which is alignment, there's an implication there around that. They're two probably really important parts of alignment. What's the distinction in your mind, and why, this is particularly thinking of the audience for this podcast in terms of employee engagers and internal communicators and OD people? What's the difference, and how do we get that right? And particularly, communication is important, but understanding is ultimately the objective of anything like that. Talk me through your logic around that, Richard, because I think it's a really important point.
Yeah, I'm going to be slightly paradoxical here as well, I think. So the first starting point is those first 2 points about clarity about what strategy is. When we are talking about strategy as a as a community, as a
Mm,
senior team, as an organization, when we use the word strategy, do we all mean the same thing?
mm,
Then from there, that it's a beautiful piece of research, and thanks for sharing it. Like, when we're saying, yeah, the strategy, yes, what we're trying to achieve, the strategy, do we all understand, are we clear and aligned on what the strategic intent is?
mm,
One of the very early clients that I worked with using the aligned approach kind of fully was relatively speaking, a small organization. They had a target of growing from 100 million to 300 million in 3 years. And I knew that it was put front and center to me. They had a senior team of 7 people, including the MD, who was also the founder. And we ran through these 6 questions. And when we came to the question about what is your key strategic objective, amongst those 7 people, there were 6 different answers.
mm,
And they all thought they were, before before I shared their answers back in front of them, if I had said to them, you are all shooting for different things, they would have laughed me out of the place.
mm.
So part of this is, are we clear and aligned on what the strategy is, exactly as that research says? And there are so many organizations that think they are aligned, and that the problem is people down the way aren't getting it.
Mm.
And a lot of the issue with strategic communications isn't an issue with communications, it's an issue with strategy.
Yeah.
So that's the first bit.
Yeah.
Then, and this I think is completely relevant to your audience, and I'm smiling, I hope they forgive me. It was in my previous consultancy days. It was back when I was at Kaizen. I remember writing this article, and I can't remember exactly the title, but it was something like "Why Most Internal Communications Are a Waste of Time." It was
Mm.
something. It was some quite inflammatory, but like that, and it rightly so. People called me out about it, but my point still stands to this day. There is too much communication which is like FYI communication.
Mm.
It's information sharing with an assumption that if we share lots of information, then we're communicating and they'll get it. And that's just, I know you know this because you're an
Yeah.
absolute master at not doing that. But the way we approach it is um, that communication should always start with an outcome.
Mm. Mm.
What is it that we want people to do differently as a result of this communication? And if it's FYI, I don't know, I'm making this up now, but let's say 99% of the time, 98% of the times, FYI is a waste of time.
Mm.
It's like, what do we want people to do differently? So once we have got crystal clear and aligned on our strategy, then we're thinking, right, what do we want what do we want the masses to do differently as a result of any strategic comms that we do? And it can really, really quickly, because I know time's against us, but
Mm.
we got invited to MC. I got invited to MC a strategic comms launch, strategy launch for a big association. It was a kind of royal standard organization, chartered organization a while ago. And I was like, I'm happy to do it. I was going to MC it. I was going to introduce people, but I was going to run some sessions on leadership and on strategy. I said, what's the actual outcome for all of this? And they said, we want people to be engaged by the new strategy, excited by the new strategy, and we want them to understand really clearly. We want them to get what their contribution to it is,
Mm.
and therefore change how they operate. So I know how I'm contributing to this, so I'm going to do this rather than that. And then they ran through what they were going to do for the kind of day and a half, day and 3/4. And it was PowerPoint presentation after PowerPoint
Mm.
presentation
Yeah.
after next big cheese, doing another PowerPoint presentation. And I had to, put my kind of big boy pants on and say, if your outcome is engagement and excitement, then getting them to sit listening to people talking about, numbers for a day and a half isn't going to do it. And it was that focus on outcome, and then saying, right, what do we actually need to activate? What do we need to put in place to cause the engagement, because people don't need to memorize every bit of the strategy, because they can go back on and look at the PowerPoint deck or whatever. What they do need to do is feel, in most cases, engaged and connected with it. So
Absolutely.
yeah, that's my view on it. We've got to make sure we're clear and aligned on what our strategy is, and then when we think about how we communicate it, we actually think about what do we want people to do as a result of the communication, and shape the whole methodology around that.
Yeah, definitely. It just reminded me, actually, in the last episode that's going out before this one, your episode, Richard. I recorded it a few days ago. I had a conversation with a lady called Nicole Byrne. Now, Nicole she's now got her own consultancy, but for 25 years she was the internal comms. She worked in internal comms as the senior internal comms person for Mercedes Formula One team and its previous incarnations. And she was telling me, if people listening to this haven't listened to the show, is that everybody, there's 2,000 people work for Mercedes F1. It's a massive organization. Everybody thinks it's only a handful of people, but it's a huge organization, huge engineering business. And she was telling me how everybody in the organization could articulate how they were contributing towards saving a 1/10 of the lap time of the Formula One car, whether they were cleaning the floors, and and this is the kind of the old NASA janitor story, but whether they were cleaning the floors in the factory or they were empty, they drove the forklifts that moved the pallets around in the yard, or they all could articulate how what I do contributes towards that car on the track saving 1/10. Now, I know sporting analogies are always dangerous because usually winning and losing is much more visible than it is for a lot of organizations. But I just really like that. And that kind of links through to what you're just saying there, is that, you could have the best internal comms in the world and all the apps and, kind of latest tools available to you. But if people can't see what they're contributing towards that kind of that massive, that strategic goal, which is their strategic goal, it's to win races, and that it means that everybody's contributing, that those marginal gains, then we're not doing our job properly. And I think that kind of links to all of the stuff we've been talking about today, I guess. And
it's why I think your work's so great, because what you, especially when talking about kind of the big picture stuff that I've seen the results of over the years, and I know you do lots of other stuff, but the end result of that is incredible, and it's a beautiful visual, and people get it, and people want to be engaged by it. But and you're welcome to say I'm wrong on this, by the way. But I think a big part of what makes your work so successful and sticky and powerful is all of the work you do to create that at the end, because that's where you're getting the engagement from those 20, 30, 40, 50% of people who you're able to interview, work with, and uncover. And by them being part of the creation of the thing, then they're engaged in the overall strategy or culture or health and safety policy or whatever it is. Because health and safety, I know it's something you do. It's another example of this. Comms. We were working with a big energy company again years ago, and they had this number one strategic imperative, which was zero harm. I think in the previous year they'd lost something like 13 people across Europe at work. But they were, it was comms after comms after comms after comms after comms, and people still weren't following every process and procedure. But if you're in that case, a guy who's been working on railroads for 40 years doing the same thing, having the same safety briefing every morning, it isn't going to have an impact.
No.
And it was only when we said, right, actually, what do you want? What's the outcome of all of the activity? Which was that every family gets their loved one home safely at the end of a working day. Right, what would you do to enable that? And they shifted the whole approach. That's when you start making a difference. And I know that aligns closely with the work that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what you've just said there is a great example, I think, of that culture and strategy having to align, because it's very often the case when we're, that's just one thing that we do. Health and safety type communication is that it's only when we're kind of either developing that solution for a client, that it becomes apparent that, okay, so what you're saying to them is you don't want them to cut corners, you don't want them to rush, you don't want them to ignore safety rules because they're under pressure to deliver, and yet all you communicate to them is production targets and failed orders, and the customer is king and all of this stuff, which is great. But tell me how someone who's sort of on a night shift in a forklift, that the lights are broken on and he's got to go, or he or she's got to drive into the yard, and they don't know where they're going. But if they don't, their boss is going to be on their back saying, "Why haven't you got that order out on time?" How do they trade that off? What's the dilemma that's going on in their mind, and how do we help them to reconcile that in a way that you want them to? Because it's up to you at the end of the day. It's your strategy. Is that more important than the production target, or do you want them to do it safely? And it's only when you ask them those questions that they actually go, "Oh God, you're right. Actually, I've not really thought about that." And it's obvious to us, but not to them, because they're giving conflicting messages all the time. So yeah, it's yeah.
I spent some time in call centers, as you know, as part of my kind of formative years of my career, and still work with Cook. And it was, similar, like less life threatening, thank goodness. But, quite often have these briefs where I go, we want to be really, customer focused organizations. And it's all about the relationship. It's all about the relationship. And then you'd look at the targets that the people on the phones that were actually, driven to deliver and had to deliver, otherwise they weren't performing. And it was, how many calls can you get through? How quickly can you wrap a call up? Calls per hour, call handling time, that kind of thing. You go, well, if that's fine. If you want people to get through calls quickly, that's how you do it. But if you want people to create great, connections between them and the customer, then forcing them to get off calls quickly, that, if one's going to give you a bonus and allow you to take your kids on the holiday that you want to in the summer, and the other one is going to be what you kind of told in team meetings, I know which one's going to win. So as you say, that's where, again, it's another really simple example of where your strategic intent, the culture you need to create, and the experience that you desire to create, have to be aligned. Otherwise, you get these conflicts.
Yeah, I had it was a guest on my show, not a client, but I was speaking to someone, and she was telling me she works for like an electrical retailer that kind of does everything online. So they have their point of contact with customers is the delivery and the sale, or the any kind of calls to the call center. And they have a mantra which I really like, which I think it goes back to the way we be round here kind of definition of culture, is that the direction they give to their people on the phone is, let me get this right now, treat everyone like your gran and make decisions that your mum would be proud of. And I just really like that. Because I think you don't need to kind of define that any further, do you? For most people, they can kind of go, right, I know what you mean.
Yeah,
and totally. To get on with it.
I had the real pleasure for a period of time to coach a lady who was at the time the VP of service for Lego. Sophie Patricios, she is.
I know Sophie.
You know Sophie.
Mm-hmm,
brilliant, brilliant human being, incredibly talented, and I remember her showing me around the contact center. I think it was a London contact center for Lego which was one of her sites. And first of all, I noticed there wasn't any wall boards. Which at that time, every call center I went into had wall boards. Which, if anyone's listening and you've never been in a call center, it's like a flat. There used to be LED screens. They're now kind of TV screens, and tells you how many calls are coming in, how many are in your call queue, how long people are being hanging on for, all those kind of things. So there's no call queues. But the other thing I noticed was, again, this is back in the day where you had things called turrets. It wasn't all on a screen. And turrets was basically where you push the button to answer a call, to hang up a call, to put people on hold. And there was little Tipex marks on all of the turrets. And I'd walked around and she was telling me about all these things and how calls get put in queues based on language, because they were a multilingual call center. And in the end I said, Sophie, I'm going to have to ask you, why is there bits of sticky paper and Tipex on all of the turrets? And she went, well, underneath that is a flashing light. And it's a light that flashes that tells you, as the advisor, if there is a big queue of people waiting in the call queue that you're answering. And I was like, okay, I get that, but why is it Tipexed out? And she said, their job on the phone is to love the one they're with.
Yeah.
My job is to, look after all of the resource and to take care of the call queues.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's fascinating.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
what made it really different was in most call centers, you might have a target of 10. You've got to get through 10 calls an hour to perform. And that would be worked out on some kind of metric, which the business had gone, okay, if we're given the right degree of service, but at the right pace and right knowledge, we probably should be able to get through 10 calls an hour.
Yeah.
So if I was getting through 8 calls an hour, if you're my boss, Craig, you would pull me and go, hey, you should be getting 10. Why are you doing 8? And I might be able to explain it.
Mm.
But also, if got really busy, what you do if it is a team leader, and I saw this time and time again in the call centers I worked with, there would be a big queue. So the team leaders would all be around going, come on, let's get through quickly. Let's get through quicker. Let's get 12 calls an hour. Let's get 14 calls an hour. So, of course, by nature, people would do it and the call quality would drop off. In Sophie's call centers and Legos, what would actually happen was if the target was 8 calls an hour at the time, if you were doing 10, over a period of a week, you would still get that little conversation where you'd be pulled away and the team lead would say, hey, Richard, I'm just checking in. I noticed you've been doing, 10 calls an hour. Is everything okay? Because they didn't want people to go too quickly.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it was that love the one you're with was so important.
Yeah.
So again, the whole way that everything was measured, everything being aligned from the strategic intent to the culture you created to the experience you had, at the end. And again, I'm saying this inherently, out of that whole strategic piece should fall your KPIs and your measures and your metrics,
Yeah.
So again, these are all anecdotes that to me point to the same thing about the alignment advantage.
Yeah. Fantastic. Anyway, that's a great point to finish off, Richard. We're coming up to the hour, and I knew this would happen with you because I always get engrossed in these conversations. So I hope the listeners have found that an interesting conversation to eavesdrop on. But thank you so much. Just in terms of finding out more about you, I'm going to put your LinkedIn profile link into the show notes. I'll obviously put a link into 21 Leadership, and I'm also going to put a link into to buying the book as well, the Alignment Advantage. Full disclosure, I've put an affiliate link in there, so we do get a little bit of help from, it's an Amazon link there, so if you buy the book from Amazon, we get a little bit back from that, but that helps us to keep the podcast free and all of this good stuff for you. I hope that's okay with you, Richard. I didn't check that before we use that beforehand. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Fantastic. Excellent. Well, look, thank you so much, Richard. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your insights, and fantastically insightful stuff. And good luck with the book. I know it's when was the book launched again?
In the UK, it came out beginning of June, US end of June. So it's
okay.
It's ticking along nicely.
Okay. Well, this is going out. This interview is going out in October, so it's going to give people another reminder about it, and hopefully give you another uplift in people showing interest in the book anyway, and obviously, hopefully, getting in touch with you, Richard, and finding out more about the excellent work that you do.
Appreciate it. Always a pleasure, Craig.
Thanks so much, Richard. Take care. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Engaging Internal Comms podcast. If you've got any ideas for episodes you'd like us to cover in future, you can email us at info@thebigpicturepeople.co.uk, or you can use the feedback form at engagingic.com. If you're not already subscribed to the show via your podcast platform, please do so. And if you could leave a review for us, that would be absolutely fantastic. We have links to other episodes at engagingic.com. All of our previous episodes are available there. And if you're interested in our visual communication services, our big pictures, our learning maps, our explainer videos, and also our live graphic recording, please get in touch with us again at info@thebigpicturepeople.co.uk. Thank you.